I never expected that one ordinary afternoon would split my life into a before and after. I had planned only a short visit to my parents' house. Nothing dramatic, at least, that was what I thought. The sun was dipping low, casting orange streaks across the sky as I drove with my son in the back seat, humming softly to himself. He was 8, my boy, my heart. And he had this innocent way of believing the world was still safe, still kind. I wanted so badly to preserve that for him. We reached my parents' home a little earlier than expected. Their house stood exactly as it always had, stern and silent, with white walls that seemed more like stone than paint. Even in my 30s, just seeing that house made me feel small, like a child about to be judged for every move. I parked outside and told my son to wait as I carried in a small bag of groceries I had picked up for my mother. I thought maybe, just maybe, if I offered small gestures of kindness, our relationship could be easier. But fate had other plans. As I stepped inside, I immediately noticed the silence. That silence that never felt peaceful, just heavy. But then, from the kitchen, voices broke out. Not just voices yelling. Sharp, cutting words that froze me in place. I hurried toward the sound, heart thundering in my chest, and the sight that met my eyes will haunt me forever. There was my son, my little boy, standing on his tiptoes, clutching a wet dishcloth in his tiny hands. The table in front of him was half cleared, plates stacked unevenly, and his small shoulders were tense, trembling. Hovering above him were my parents, my father's voice booming like thunder, my mother's sharper, more precise. Like knives. "What do you think you're doing?" my father barked. "You're doing it wrong. Look at this mess," my mother snapped, her finger jabbing at the table. "You're lazy, careless. If you're going to clean, then clean." My son flinched at every word, his lips pressed tight to stop the quiver. His little chest rose and fell too quickly, and I could see his eyes, those wide, fearful eyes, searching for escape, searching for me, and something inside me snapped. I had been raised in that same house, under those same voices, those same cruel standards. But seeing it directed at my son was like fire through my veins. "Enough!" I shouted, louder than I thought I could. The room froze. My parents turned, startled, their faces a mix of annoyance and shock. My father's brows furrowed, his jaw clenching. My mother's lips pressed together in that familiar way, like she was preparing to scold me for interrupting. I rushed to my son, kneeling down so I could look into his eyes. His little hands were shaking, dishcloth still damp and dripping onto the floor. "It's okay, baby," I whispered, pulling him gently toward me. "You don't have to do this." He collapsed against me, wrapping his small arms around my neck. And as I held him, I felt his body trembling, the way mine once had, years ago. Behind me, my father's voice growled, "You're coddling him again. He needs discipline. That boy will grow up weak if you don't let him learn." I stood, still holding my son close. "He's 8 years old," I said, my voice low but firm. 8. And you're screaming at him like he's some servant. Do you hear yourselves? My mother crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing. "When you were 8, you did chores without complaint. You cleaned, you obeyed. That's why you're strong now." Strong. The word tasted bitter on my tongue, because I remembered exactly what strong meant in their language. It meant silent. It meant obedient. It meant broken. I turned to face them fully then, my son's head resting against my shoulder. My heart was pounding so hard I thought they might see it through my chest. "Strong," I whispered, though my words carried like a blade. "Do you want to know what strong is?" Strong is surviving you. My father's eyes narrowed dangerously. My mother's lips parted, a faint gasp escaping her throat. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. I swore to myself, I continued, voice shaking but steady, that I would never, ever let my child grow up the way I did in this house. And today, seeing you yelling at him for touching your dishes, for trying to help, I realize I've already failed. Because I brought him here. The silence that followed was heavy. My parents stood stiff, their faces unreadable, but I could see the storm gathering in their eyes. My son's tiny fingers clutched at my shirt, holding on for safety, for reassurance that I wouldn't let go. And in that moment, I knew this was just the beginning of a battle I had avoided all my life. But no more. I kissed the top of my son's head and whispered softly so only he could hear, "You're safe now. I won't let them hurt you." But inside, I was already trembling. Because facing my parents was one thing. Protecting my son from them and from the tangled web of guilt, control, and manipulation they spun so easily, that would be something else entirely. And I didn't know yet just how far they were willing to go to keep their hold. But I was ready. For him, I would be ready. After that night, when I left my parents' house holding my son tightly against me, I couldn't sleep. Even as he drifted into the safety of dreams beside me, my own mind wouldn't quiet. Every echo of my parents' voices was louder in the dark, bouncing off the walls of my skull until I felt like a child again, trapped, helpless, desperate for someone to shield me. But there had been no one, and that was the memory that clawed its way up from the corners of my mind. I was 8, the same age my son is now. The house looked almost identical, same cold walls, same ticking clock on the wall, same smell of bleach and cooking oil. I was standing in the kitchen, just as he had been, holding a rag in my hand. I remember how heavy the dishes seemed back then, how my little arms strained just to lift them. I wanted to be perfect. I wanted to hear "good job" at least once. But that was not the language of my parents' house. Instead, I heard the sharp slap of my mother's hand against the counter. "Not like that. You're sloppy. Look at the streaks on this plate. Can't you do anything right?" My father's voice joined, deeper, harsher. "You think life is going to forgive you for half-done work? No one respects laziness. Do it again. Do it properly." My chest would tighten, my throat burning with swallowed tears. Because crying wasn't allowed either. Crying was weakness. And weakness was punished. One time, I remember, a single tear slipped from my eye. My father grabbed my wrist so hard it left marks. "Stop that," he hissed. "Stop it right now. Do you want to grow up pathetic?" I learned quickly how to silence myself, how to nod, how to bow my head, how to force my trembling hands to move faster, sharper. I learned to bury every flicker of fear or sadness deep inside, because showing it only brought more pain. That was their version of discipline. When I turned 10, the punishments changed shape. They weren't just words. My father made me stand in the corner for hours if I dared to talk back. My mother would withhold meals if I failed a chore. I remember going to bed hungry, stomach growling, but knowing if I asked for food she'd call me ungrateful. I would lie in that dark bedroom, listening to the house creak, whispering promises to myself. One day, I'll leave. One day, I'll be free. One day, I'll have a family of my own, and it will be different. Those promises were the only light I had, but freedom didn't come easily. Even after I grew older, even after I moved out, their voices stayed in my head. That was the cruelest part. They didn't need to be in the room anymore. The damage lived inside me, And yet, despite everything, I still went back. I told myself I was strong enough now, that their words couldn't touch me the way they once did. I told myself I could manage a relationship, that maybe if I stayed patient, they'd soften with age. But the truth was, part of me still craved their approval. That's the trap of parents like mine. You spend your whole life bleeding for their love, thinking if you just give more, endure more, obey more, maybe then they'll finally see you. Maybe then they'll finally say, I'm proud of you. But they never did. Not once. That night, holding my son after the storm of their yelling, I realized something that made me sick to my stomach. I had brought him into the very same cycle I swore I'd escape. He was 8 my age when it began for me. And already, he had felt the weight of their anger. Already his small shoulders had carried the burden of the impossible expectations, and it broke me. I pressed my lips to his hair as he slept and whispered, I'm sorry, baby. I'm so sorry, because it wasn't just them. It was me too. For thinking I could balance both worlds, for thinking I could protect him from people who had never protected me. I stared at the ceiling long into the night, hearing the echoes of my past and the cries my son hadn't let out in front of them. And for the first time in years, I allowed myself to cry. Quietly, in the dark, my tears sliding into his soft hair. Not just for me, but for every child, including him, who had ever been made to feel small, voiceless, unworthy, in a place that was supposed to be safe. The next morning, as sunlight crept through the curtains, I knew something had shifted. I couldn't undo my childhood. I couldn't erase what had been done to me. But I could stop it here. With him, I could be the mother I had needed, and if that meant standing against my parents, if that meant cutting ties with the only family I had known, then so be it, because my son deserved better. And so did I. That was the beginning of my decision. But decisions are easy in the quiet of your own room, with no one to challenge them. The real battle began when my parents realized I wasn't going to bend anymore, and they weren't about to let me go without a fight. The next time I brought my son to their house, I swore it would be different. Not because they had changed, but because I had. I parked in their driveway, my knuckles white against the steering wheel, breathing slowly, trying to calm the storm in my chest. My son was in the back seat, swinging his legs, humming the same little tune he always hummed when he felt nervous. "Mom," he asked softly, leaning forward. "Do I have to go inside?" The question pierced me deeper than anything my parents had ever said. My little boy, who should have felt excited to see his grandparents, was afraid. His voice trembled with the same unease I once carried every time I heard my father's footsteps in the hall. I turned to him, brushing his hair gently with my fingers. "You don't have to do anything," I said, steadying my voice. "We'll go in for a little while, but I'll be right here the whole time. And if you're uncomfortable, you tell me. Do you understand?" He nodded, though his eyes still darted nervously toward the house. As we walked up the stone path, every crunch of gravel under my shoes felt like a drumbeat of warning. I told myself I was ready, but the truth, I was shaking inside, because I knew the moment I stood up to them fully, there'd be no going back. My mother opened the door before I even knocked, her face breaking into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, finally," she said, pulling me into a stiff embrace. Her gaze flickered down to my son. "Well, come in. We've already set the table for dinner." The smell of roasted chicken and spices wafted from the kitchen, a smell that once meant comfort but now twisted in my stomach. We sat at the dining table. My father was already there, carving the chicken with the same sharp precision he used in every part of his life. He barely looked up as he said, "Sit down. Don't just stand there." We obeyed. Old habits die hard. Dinner began in silence, the scrape of cutlery filling the room. My son sat quietly, barely touching his food. I wanted to nudge him, to reassure him, but I knew my parents' eyes were sharp, waiting for any excuse. It didn't take long. "Why aren't you eating?" my father asked suddenly, his voice a command, not a question. My son froze, fork hovering above his plate. I'm not that hungry," he whispered. My father's hand slammed against the table, rattling the dishes. My son jumped, his fork clattering to the floor. "You don't waste food in this house," my father thundered. "You eat what's in front of you. Do you understand me?" The words cut the air, sharp and suffocating. My son's eyes filled with panic, darting to me. I set my fork down carefully. "He doesn't have to eat if he isn't hungry," I said, my voice calm but trembling with fury underneath. My father's eyes snapped to me, cold and unyielding. "This is why he's soft. You let him decide everything. Children don't know what's good for them. You're raising him weak just like you always were." I felt my blood boil. "Weak," I repeated, my voice shaking now. "Do you know why I was weak? Because I spent my entire childhood terrified of you. Because every word from your mouth told me I wasn't enough. And now you're doing the same to him." My mother's face hardened. "We disciplined you because we cared. That's what parents do. We didn't want you to grow up spoiled." I laughed bitterly. "Spoiled? You call Hunger Games and screaming spoiled? You call stripping a child of her voice, her worth, her safety, caring?" Silence followed, heavy and dangerous. My father's grip tightened around his knife, his jaw clenching so hard I thought it might crack. My son pressed closer to me, his small hand sliding into mine under the table. His little palm was damp with sweat, but it grounded me. It reminded me exactly why I was doing this. I leaned forward, my voice louder, steadier. "Listen to me carefully. You will not raise your voice at my son again. You will not belittle him. You will not break him the way you tried to break me. He is not your child, he is mine. And I will protect him with everything I have." My father's eyes narrowed, his voice dropping into that dangerous tone I remembered too well. "You forget yourself. This is our family. You don't speak to me that way in my house." I held his stare, for the first time in my life not looking away. My hands were shaking under the table, but my voice came out stronger than I expected. "Then maybe we shouldn't be in your house anymore." My mother gasped, her hand flying to her chest. "You wouldn't dare." "I would." I cut her off sharply. "I would and I will, if this doesn't change. Because my son comes first. Always." For a moment, no one spoke. The air was thick with a storm that had been brewing for decades, finally breaking open. My father leaned back slowly, his eyes hard as stone. "You think you're stronger than us," he said, almost amused. "You think you're better. But you're still that scared little girl. Don't fool yourself. Maybe once he would have been right, but not anymore." Not with my son's small hand gripping mine, trusting me to be the shield he never had. I looked at my father and said the words I had never dared speak before. "I'm not scared of you anymore." The dinner ended in silence after that. My parents didn't yell further, but their eyes burned holes through me as I gathered my son's hand and led him out the door. As we stepped into the night air, cool and sharp against my skin, my son looked up at me, his voice trembling. "Mom, are we in trouble?" I knelt down in front of him, brushing his hair back, holding his face between my hands. "No, sweetheart," I whispered. "Not anymore. We're not in trouble." "They are," and though my voice was calm, my chest was pounding. Because deep down, I knew this confrontation was only the beginning. They wouldn't let me go easily. And the battle for my son's safety and my own freedom was far from over. That night, after the dinner confrontation, I lay awake again. The house was quiet, my son asleep beside me, his little breaths steady and peaceful. But my mind refused to rest. It wasn't just the anger in my father's eyes that haunted me. It wasn't just the bitter silence of my mother, her lips pressed tight as if swallowing poison. It was the way my son's hand had trembled in mine under the table, the way his eyes had begged me silently, "Please don't let them hurt me." And in that silence, a memory I had buried for years forced its way back to the surface. I was 11. The punishment came because I had forgotten to scrub the bathtub properly. My mother ran her finger along the tiles and found a faint line of soak scum. She had looked at me as if I had betrayed her. "You think this is acceptable?" she hissed, dragging me by the arm into the bathroom. My skin burned under her grip. I tried to explain I had done my best. I was tired from schoolwork. I didn't even notice the spot. But excuses were forbidden. "Lazy," she spat. "Ungrateful." When my father came home and she told him, I thought maybe he would soften. Sometimes, rarely he did. But that day his face turned dark. "Get the belt," he said simply. My stomach dropped. My legs felt like stone. But I obeyed, because disobedience meant worse. I fetched it from the closet, the leather heavy in my small hands. He made me hold out my palms, 10 strikes. Hard enough to leave raised welts that burned 4 days. I remember biting my lip until I tasted blood, because crying would only make him add more. My mother stood in the doorway, arms crossed, eyes cold. When it was over, my father said, "Now do it again. And do it right this time." So with my swollen hands trembling, I scrubbed the bathtub until my fingers blistered. The smell of bleach choking me, tears dripping silently onto the tiles, and the worst part. The next day, I went to school pretending nothing had happened, smiling, laughing, because shame kept me quiet. Because somewhere deep inside, I believed maybe they were right, maybe I was lazy, ungrateful, unworthy. That belief lingered for years. Now, lying in bed beside my son, I pressed my face into the pillow to muffle the sob that tore from my throat. I had sworn I would never tell anyone that memory. But it was clawing its way out now, burning through me, reminding me with vicious clarity. My parents had not just been strict. They had been cruel. They had been dangerous. And if they had done it to me, what would stop them from doing it to my son if I ever left him alone with them? That thought made my blood run cold. I turned and looked at him sleeping peacefully, his small hand curled near his face, the innocence in his expression so fragile it made my chest ache. I couldn't risk it. Not ever. The following morning, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, staring at the rising steam like it might give me answers. My phone buzzed on the counter. A message from my mother. "We need to talk. You were disrespectful yesterday." My jaw tightened. The word disrespectful had always been her favorite weapon. She used it to silence me, to twist every argument until somehow I was the problem. Another message followed almost immediately. "If you keep this up, you'll regret it." My fingers trembled as I set the phone down. The old fear rose up again. wrapping around my ribs like iron chains. But then I looked toward the living room, where my son was sitting cross-legged on the floor, humming as he played with his toy cars, and I knew no amount of fear, no threat, no manipulation would be enough to make me back down this time, because this wasn't just about me anymore. But still, a part of me wondered if I was overreacting, if maybe they were right, and I was being dramatic. That little voice in my head, my parents' voice, whispered that maybe I was exaggerating, maybe I was too soft, as I did something I had never done before. I opened an old box from the back of my closet, one I hadn't touched in years. Inside were scraps of my childhood, old notebooks, a few photos, a diary I had kept hidden under my mattress as a teenager. The diary was small, its cover worn, pages filled with my cramped handwriting. I flipped it open, and there was entry after entry describing punishments, the fear, the longing for escape. One passage stopped me cold. March 12th. Today they locked me outside in the cold because I came home 5 minutes late. I stood there shivering until my lips turned blue. I don't know how long it was, maybe an hour, maybe more. When they finally let me in, they said it was to teach me responsibility. But all I learned is that home isn't safe. I pressed a hand to my mouth, tears streaming down my cheeks. I had forgotten that day, or maybe I had forced myself to forget. And now, reading my own words, I realized my parents weren't just strict, they were abusive. That word had always felt too big, too heavy. But now I couldn't deny it. It was the truth, and the truth burned when my son came over and curled up against me, asking, why are you crying?" I hugged him so tightly he squeaked in protest. "I just remembered something, sweetheart," I whispered, kissing his hair. "But don't worry. It's not going to happen to you. I promise." That night, I made a decision. I would confront them, not just about the yelling, not just about their treatment of my son, but about the truth, about what they did to me. Because if I didn't, the cycle would never end. I didn't know yet what I would say or how far they would go to defend themselves. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't going to swallow it down. I was going to speak, even if my voice shook, even if it broke everything. The next day, I dialed my parents' number. My hand trembled as I held the phone, but my voice was steady when my mother answered. "We need to talk," I said. There was a pause, then her clipped reply, "Finally. Come over tonight." It wasn't a request, it never was. As evening settled in, I drove to their house with my son, though every fiber of my being screamed to keep him away. But I knew if I left him behind, they would accuse me of hiding him, of poisoning him against them. So I brought him, but with one promise to myself. I would not let him out of my sight. He clutched my hand tightly as we walked up the path. His little voice whispered, "Mom, do we have to?" I squeezed back gently. "Just stay close to me. I won't let go." The house felt colder that night, not in temperature, but in spirit. The moment we stepped inside, the air was heavy, suffocating. My father sat in his chair, the living room dimly lit by the lamp beside him. My mother stood by the window, arms folded. "Well," my father said, not looking up from the newspaper he wasn't really reading. "You've caused enough trouble. Explain yourself." My son pressed closer against my side. I drew in a long breath. This was it. "I'm not here to explain myself," I said, my voice firm. "I'm here to tell you that things are going to change. Starting now." My father lowered the paper slowly, his eyes dark with challenge. "Excuse me." I took a step forward, pulling my son slightly behind me. I will not let you yell at him again. I will not let you make him feel the way you made me feel my entire childhood. It ends here, my mother scoffed, her voice sharp as broken glass. Don't be ridiculous. We raised you with discipline, and you turned out just fine. Fine, my laugh cracked, bitter and raw. You think I turned out fine? You think it was fine to hit me with a belt until my hand swelled? To lock me outside in the freezing cold because I was 5 minutes late? To scream at me until I believed I was worthless? Their faces flickered just for a moment with something I couldn't name. Denial? Shame? No, not shame. They didn't. No shame. That never happened, my mother said quickly, her voice rising. You're exaggerating, as always. You were a difficult child. You needed correction. I felt the heat rising in my chest. I wrote it down, I snapped. I found my old diary yesterday. Every word, every punishment, every time you broke me, it's all there. Don't you dare tell me it didn't happen. My father stood then, slowly, deliberately. His presence filled the room the way it always had. Watch your tone, he said quietly. That voice, the one that had frozen me for years, still carried the weight of threat. But this time, I didn't flinch. No, I said. For once, you will listen. I'm not afraid of you anymore. The silence stretched, thick as smoke. My son's little fingers dug into my side, but I felt his trust in me. That trust gave me strength. You think you're protecting him? My father said finally, his lips curling. But you're spoiling him. You're making him weak. The world will eat him alive. The world is hard enough, I shot back. He doesn't need cruelty from his own family. My mother's voice cut in, shrill. You're ungrateful. After all we did for you, ungrateful. My laugh was hollow. I spent my childhood desperate for a scrap of your approval. I bled for it, cried for it, begged for it. And you never once said you were proud of me. Not once. Their silence was answer enough. I stepped closer, my heart pounding, but my words steady. So hear me now. If you can't treat my son with kindness, if you can't respect him as the child he is, then you will not see him again. This is your choice. My mother's face went pale. You wouldn't dare. I met her eyes unblinking. Try me? For the first time in my life, I saw something flicker in their expressions, uncertainty. They weren't used to me standing tall. They weren't used to me having power. But just as quickly, my father's face hardened again. You'll come crawling back, he said coldly. You always do. Maybe once he would have been right. But not anymore. I turned, my son's small hand locked in mine, and walked out the door. In the car, as I started the engine, my son whispered, "Mom, are we not going to see them anymore?" I looked at him in the rearview mirror, his big eyes searching mine. Unsure. That depends, I said softly. If they can change, maybe. But if they don't, I paused, my throat tightening. Then no, because you deserve better. We both do. He nodded slowly, then smiled a small, fragile smile. Okay. And in that moment, I realized this was the turning point. For the first time in my life, I wasn't just surviving them. I was standing against them. And I would never go back. The days after the confrontation were eerily quiet at first. Too quiet. I half expected the phone to ring the moment I got home. I expected messages, threats, maybe even my parents showing up at my door. But instead silence, and sometimes, silence is worse than noise. On the third morning, the first call came. It wasn't my mother or father. It was my aunt, my mother's sister. She started with small talk, asking about my son, about work, about things she hadn't bothered with in years. I knew what was coming before she finally sighed and said, "Your parents are very upset you." No, I closed my eyes, pinching the bridge of my nose. "I'm sure they are. They told me what you said. How could you speak to them like that? After everything they've done for you?" There it was, the script I'd been expecting. The words they always used when they wanted to put me back in my place. I took a steady breath. "Auntie, I'm not going to argue. You weren't there. You didn't see how they screamed at my son. And you didn't live my childhood, you don't know." A beat of silence. Then, her voice soft but pointed, "You're going to regret cutting ties with your parents. Family is all we have." I hung up soon after, politely but firmly. My hands shook, but I didn't cry, because I knew now that wasn't love. That was control, wrapped in guilt. By the end of the week, more calls followed. Cousins I hadn't spoken to in years, a neighbor who just wanted to help, even my father's friend who left a long voicemail about respecting elders. It was clear that they weren't going to confront me directly. Instead, they were sending others to do their dirty work. It felt like a net tightening around me. One evening, after dinner, I was washing the dishes when I heard my phone buzz on the counter. Another unfamiliar number. I hesitated, then answered. "Hello there." Was a pause. Then my mother's voice, soft and trembling. "It's me." I froze, the plate slipping slightly in my hand. She never sounded like that. My mother was sharp edges, iron and fire. But tonight, her tone was different. Fragile. I didn't sleep last night," she said. "I kept hearing your words. You said we made you feel worthless. Do you really believe that?" The ache in her voice stirred something deep in me, old reflexes, old guilt. Part of me wanted to comfort her, to smooth it over, to say, "No, Mom, it's not that bad." But then I looked over at my son, curled up on the couch with his homework, humming softly to himself. His safety, his joy, that was my truth. "Yes," I said firmly. "I do believe that. Because it's true." Her breath hitched. Then, the fragility melted away. "You're cruel," she spat. "Cruel and selfish. We sacrificed everything for you, and this is how you repay us. By poisoning your child against us." There it was, the mask slipping. I closed my eyes, gripping the counter for strength. "I'm protecting him, not poisoning him. And if you can't see the difference, then you'll never understand me." She hung up. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet rhythm of my son's breathing from the next room. The guilt clawed at me. Every word my mother had said replayed in my mind like poison. Selfish, cruel, ungrateful. But then another memory surfaced, her voice yelling at my son, calling him useless for not stacking the plates fast enough. The fear in his eyes, the way his little shoulders curled inward. I would not let that memory repeat. I whispered into the dark, "You will not break him the way you broke me." The following weekend, the storm finally broke. I had taken my son to the park, trying to give him a sense of normalcy. When I saw them, my parents, standing at the edge of the playground, watching us, my son spotted them before I did. He froze, his small hand gripping mine so tight his knuckles turned white. "Mom," he whispered, "I don't want to go." I bent down to his level, holding his face gently in my hands. "You don't have to. You don't have to go anywhere you don't want to." I stood tall then, walking toward them. My father's jaw was tight, his eyes dark with authority. My mother's lips pressed into a thin line. "You shouldn't be here," I said firmly. "You can't keep us away from our grandson." My mother snapped. "We have rights." "No," I said, my voice low and unwavering. "You have expectations, and they're not the same thing." My father stepped closer, lowering his voice so only I could hear. "You think you're strong now, but we've held this family together for decades. People respect us. If you cut us off, you'll be the one everyone blames." I held his stare, refusing to look away. "Then let them blame me. I'd rather be blamed than let my son suffer." For the first time, I saw something shift in his eyes. Not fear, not guilt, but frustration. Power slipping. He leaned back, his voice cold. "You'll regret this." Maybe I would, but not as much as I'd regret staying silent. That night, after putting my son to bed, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea. My hands trembled as I held the mug, but my heart felt strangely steady. The war wasn't over, not by a long shot. I knew they would try again. More guilt, more manipulation, more attempts to paint me as the villain. But I also knew this. For the first time in my life, I wasn't alone. My son believed in me, and that was enough to keep fighting. The following week, the whispers began. At first, I thought it was just in my head. A few neighbors glancing my way a little too long, their smiles brittle, their voices dropping as I walked by. But soon it became undeniable. The stories had started to spread. She screamed at her parents. She won't let them see their grandson. She's ungrateful after everything they sacrificed. It didn't matter if those things were twisted half-truths or outright lies. My parents knew exactly what strings to pull. Respectability, reputation, the very currency they had hoarded their entire lives, and now they were spending it to destroy me. One evening at the grocery store, I bumped into an old family friend. Her expression was awkward, caught between sympathy and judgment. "I heard," she began, trailing off, her eyes darting to the people nearby. I knew what she'd heard. Everyone had. I forced a smile. "I'm sure you have. But you know what? Believe whatever you like. I'm too tired to correct the story anymore." She blinked, startled. I think she expected me to deny, to explain, to plead for understanding. But I wasn't playing defense anymore. Not when my son's well-being was on the line. Still, it hurt. The loneliness crept in late at night, when the house was quiet and I was left with my thoughts. I missed having a family. Not the pain, not the cruelty, but the idea of belonging. I grieved the version of my parents I had always wished for, the ones who could have been kind, supportive, proud. But grieving a fantasy is its own kind of prison. So I told myself, belonging isn't worth it if it costs my son his peace. The real breaking point came when my cousin messaged me late one night. "Hey," she wrote, "I don't know if I should be saying this, but your parents are telling everyone you're unstable, that you're raising your son to hate them. Some people believe it." My throat tightened. I typed, deleted, then finally replied, "Thank you for telling me. It's not true. But I guess that doesn't matter, does it?" Her response came quickly. "It matters to me. I believe you. And can I tell you something? There's something you don't know. Something about the way they treated your mom when she was younger." I sat up straighter, heart pounding. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, then typed, "My grandmother, your mom's mother, was exactly like her. Cold, controlling." I heard stories. Your MOM grew up with the same kind of yelling, the same kind of shaming. She once told my MOM that she hated it, that she'd never treat her kids that way, but she did. Maybe because it was all she knew. I stared at the screen, my chest heavy with a mix of rage and sorrow. As though the cycle went deeper than me. Generations of cruelty, passed down like heirlooms nobody wanted. The revelation didn't excuse anything my parents had done, but it explained the shape of their anger, the weight of their demands, the way they wielded guilt like a weapon. They hadn't healed. They had just handed me the same burden they carried, and here I was, deciding whether to pass it down to my son or to break it, no matter the cost. That night, I sat with my journal open, writing furiously. They gave me chains, I wrote. But I will not give them to my son. Let it end. Days later, the phone rang again. This time, it was my father. Your mother's not well, he said flatly. She can't sleep. She can't eat. You're killing her with this behavior. I felt the old guilt tugging, but then I thought about what my cousin had said. My mother had once been a little girl too frightened, powerless, silenced. Somewhere along the way, she had chosen to become the very thing she feared. I wouldn't make that same choice. I'm sorry she's struggling, I said carefully. But I won't carry the blame for her choices anymore. I'm not killing her. I'm just refusing to die inside for her comfort. The silence on the other end stretched long. Then, his voice sharpened. You'll regret this. He hung up. Later that evening, as I tucked my son into bed, he looked up at me with his big, searching eyes. MOM, he whispered, why don't Grandma and Grandpa like me? The question cut through me like glass. I kissed his forehead and held him close. It's not you they don't like, baby. It's their own pain. They don't know how to love the right way. But I promise you this, I love you enough for both of them. He nodded slowly, clinging to me, and I felt the weight of generations pressing down on my shoulders. But I also felt something else rising up inside me, resolve. If my parents wanted a war of words, if they wanted to poison the world with rumors and lies, so be it. But I had the truth, and more importantly, I had a son who believed in me. That night, for the first time in weeks, I slept soundly, because now I understood. This wasn't just about revenge. This was about rewriting the story for the next generation. The quiet didn't last long. Just when I thought the storm had passed, they found another way to claw back into my life. A letter arrived. Not handwritten, not warm, cold, typed, and delivered in a stiff white envelope with my father's signature at the bottom. It was a notice, a threat of legal action for grandparents' visitation rights. My hand shook as I read the words over and over again. It wasn't just the paper, it was what it represented. My parents were willing to drag my son through the courts, to turn love into a battlefield, all to prove their control. I crumpled the letter in my fist. For a moment, panic gripped me. I had no idea what the law said, no idea what they could or couldn't take from me. But underneath the fear, something else stirred rage. They weren't fighting for love. They were fighting for dominance. And that I would never allow. I called my cousin, the one who had told me about my mother's past. My voice trembled as I explained the letter. She sighed heavily. They'll use every weapon they can, even the law. But remember, courts don't look kindly on cruelty. If they try, you can tell your story too, and people will believe you. You're not powerless. Her words steadied me. For so long, my parents had been the narrators of my life, telling their version of who I was to everyone who would listen. But what if I took back the story? What if I told it in my own voice truthfully, clearly, without shame? I'd always feared airing the family's secrets. But silence was a prison, and they were counting on it. 2 nights later, the confrontation came. They showed up at my door unannounced. My father's face was grim, my mother's eyes red-rimmed but hard. I didn't invite them in. I stood in the doorway, my son peeking curiously from behind me. "You're forcing our hand," my father said flatly. "If you won't let us see him, we'll let the judge decide." I straightened my shoulders, my pulse hammering. "You want a judge? Fine. But let me make something clear: if this goes to court, I will tell them everything. Every insult, every time you tried to shame me, every time you yelled at an 8-year-old for not scrubbing dishes fast enough. I'll tell them about the way you treat people as if they're tools instead of family." "Do you really want that story on record?" My mother flinched, but my father's jaw only tightened. "You're being dramatic," he hissed. But then something unexpected happened. A small voice broke in. "Stop yelling at my mom." We all froze. My son had stepped out from behind me, his fists balled at his sides, his little chin lifted. His voice wavered, but his words rang clear. "You don't get to scare her. She takes care of me. She's the best mom. And if you don't like us, then don't come back." The silence that followed was deafening. My parents stared at him, utterly thrown off. In their world, children were supposed to be silent, obedient, invisible until commanded. But here was their grandson, standing like a tiny soldier, refusing to bow. Something inside me cracked wide open. Pride. Fierce, unstoppable pride. I bent down, resting a hand on his shoulder. "That's enough, sweetheart." "Thank you." He leaned into me, but his eyes never left their steady, unafraid. My father muttered something under his breath, then turned sharply and walked away. My mother lingered for a moment longer, her eyes darting between me and my son. For a flicker of a second, I saw something: pain, maybe even shame, but then it was gone. She pulled her coat tighter and followed him down the driveway. The door closed behind them with a final thud. I sank onto the couch, pulling my son into my arms. My heart was still pounding, but not from fear. From revelation. They could threaten. They could spread lies. They could drag me through courts and gossip mills. But nothing they did could erase the truth my son had just spoken. We were stronger without them. The next morning, I opened my journal again. This time, the words flowed like fire. They wanted to own me. But they don't own my voice. They don't own my child. Their power ends where my courage begins. Later that week, I scheduled an appointment with a lawyer. Not because I was certain they would follow through, but because I wanted to be ready. And more than that, I wanted to send them a message. The cycle ended here. They had underestimated me. They had underestimated the little boy they thought they could break, and now we were no longer playing defense. We were taking control. They didn't stay gone for long. A week passed in uneasy silence, and I allowed myself to believe, just for a breath, that maybe they had given up. That maybe my father's retreat and my mother's silence meant they were finished trying to break me. But my parents never gave up power easily. It came. Not in another letter, not in another doorstep confrontation. It came as a phone call in the middle of the night. The shrill ring jolted me awake. My heart thudded as I reached for the phone, fearing bad news. "Hello," my voice cracked. It was my sister. Her words tumbled out in a rush. "Mom collapsed. She's in the hospital. You need to come. For a moment, all my anger dissolved into raw panic. No matter how fractured we were, the thought of my mother lying helpless in a sterile hospital room twisted my stomach. I threw on a sweater, woke my son gently, and drove through the dark streets with shaking hands. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and sorrow. I found her in a bed, pale, hooked up to machines. My father sat stiffly in the corner, arms crossed, his eyes gleaming with something unreadable. When he saw me, he straightened. She asked for you. I swallowed hard and approached the bed. My mother's eyes fluttered open, weak but still sharp. Her hand trembled as she reached for mine. Sweetheart, she whispered, I don't want to fight anymore. Let's stop this nonsense. Family should be together. The words struck deep. Part of me wanted to collapse into them, to believe her at last. But another part of me, the part forged in years of surviving her manipulation, recognized the pattern. This was her oldest trick. Playing frail, playing the victim, turning illness into leverage. I glanced at my father. His expression wasn't grief. It was triumph. He thought he had me cornered, thought compassion would chain me back to them. But then I felt a tug on my sleeve. My son, standing beside me, his small face solemn. He whispered, "Mom, don't let them trick you. You said we don't have to let people hurt us, even if they're family." The clarity of his words cut through the fog like lightning. I turned back to my mother, her hand still clutching mine. "You're right," I said softly. "Family should be together. But family also means safety, respect, love without conditions. And you never gave me that." Her eyes widened, as if the words physically stuck. I continued, my voice steady, "I won't let you use sickness as a rope to pull me back into silence. I'm not that little girl anymore. And he's not the child you get to scold and shame. If you really want family, then start by admitting what you've done. Until then, we're done." The air thickened. My father surged to his feet. "How dare you talk to your mother like that? She's ill." I turned to him, my voice sharper than I'd ever allowed before. "She's not ill. She's powerful. She always has been. And so have you. You've both used that power to crush me, to try to control my son. But tonight, I'm finished pretending. Your reign over me is over." For the first time, my father had no words. He opened his mouth, then shut it again, his face dark with rage but also just faintly uncertainty. And then, from the doorway, another voice. "I wondered when you'd finally say it out loud." We all turned. It was my cousin, the one who had told me the truth about my mother's past. She stepped into the room, her gaze sweeping over all of us. "I came to check on her," she said, nodding at my mother. "But I heard enough. And she's right." She pointed to me. "The truth always leaks through eventually. You two," she jabbed a finger at my parents, "have been tearing people down for decades. And you've been counting on no one being brave enough to call it what it is. Well, guess what? The cycle ends here." The room exploded with tension. My mother gasped. My father growled something under his breath. But I felt it something shift. For the first time, I wasn't alone in my confrontation. For the first time, the story wasn't just mine to tell. Others knew, others saw, and once truth is spoken aloud, it can't be shoved back into silence. I held my son's hand and turned to leave. My mother called after me, her voice cracking, "If you walk out now, don't come back." I paused at the door. I looked over my shoulder, calm, unflinching. "I'm not walking out. I'm walking free." And with that, I stepped into the hallway. my son's small hand warm in mine, my cousin close behind. That night, as I tucked him into bed, my son whispered, "Mom, are they gone forever?" I brushed his hair back, kissed his forehead. "They can try to come back," I said softly. "But the difference is we don't have to let them in. Not into our house, not into our hearts. We get to choose who we call family." His eyes fluttered closed, and for the first time in years, I felt peace settle over me. Because the truth was clear. The war was over. And I had won not by destroying them, but by refusing to be destroyed. The days after the hospital confrontation were a strange mixture of calm and tension. My parents didn't call. They didn't send messages. They stayed away. I don't know if it was shame, anger, or pride keeping them in retreat. But the silence was almost comforting. Almost. I used the quiet to focus on my son. We cooked together, sang silly songs in the living room, and he taught me how to stack blocks in patterns I never thought possible. Each laughter-filled evening chipped away at the remnants of fear that had lingered in my chest for decades. But the world outside our little sanctuary wasn't always quiet. The rumors my parents had spread didn't vanish overnight. A few relatives still glanced sideways at me during family gatherings. Neighbors whispered when I walked by. The weight of their judgment pressed, subtle but relentless. Yet, something inside me had shifted. I didn't need them to see me as perfect. I didn't need them to approve of my life. For the first time, I was living for me and for my son. One morning, a message popped up on my phone. It was from an old friend I hadn't spoken to in years. "I heard what happened. I'm so proud of you. If you ever need anything, I'm here." I blinked at the words, tears threatening to spill. It was the first time I realized something important. Family isn't only the people you share blood with. Family is the people who stand by you when you're being attacked. Family is the people who lift you up rather than tear you down. I forwarded the message to my son. "See, some people have always been on our side," he grinned. "That's a real family." I nodded, holding him close. Exactly. The next challenge came unexpectedly. One afternoon, a lawyer called with a polite but firm message. My parents had indeed filed for visitation rights. The legal system, it seemed, would hear both sides. For a moment, I panicked. But then I remembered everything we had been through: the yelling, the manipulation, the threats, the guilt. I remembered my son standing up in front of them, fearless. I remembered the cousin who had backed me up. I remembered my own voice, finally untangled from years of silence. I took a deep breath. The court date arrived, tense and bright. My parents sat on one side of the room, stiff and formal, their expressions unreadable. I sat with my son on my lap, my cousin beside me, and my lawyer quietly guiding us through the proceedings. When my turn came, I spoke clearly, honestly, without anger or tears. I recounted the facts, the yelling, the threats, the past abuse I had endured as a child, the pattern of control, and the manipulations used against me and my son. I didn't embellish. I didn't plead. I told the truth, and the court listened. By the end of the day, the ruling came. Visitation rights would be supervised, and my parents would have no unilateral control over my son. The judge emphasized the child's safety and well-being as paramount. When the gavel fell, I felt a strange, almost foreign sensation: peace. Not triumph, not revenge, but peace. Walking out of the courthouse, my son skipped alongside me, clutching my hand. "Mom," he said, "we're really free now, aren't we?" I smiled, squeezing his hand. "Yes, baby. Free. And this time, it's forever." The weeks that followed were gentle and transformative. I found myself sharing my story online, anonymously at first, in forums and support groups for parents and children escaping toxic family dynamics. The response was overwhelming, people from all over the country writing, commenting, telling me their own stories. It was surreal to realize that our private pain had a voice in the world, and that voice could help others. Then, one evening, I got a message from someone unexpected, a distant cousin I had barely spoken to growing up. "I saw your posts. I can't believe what you went through. I just want you to know you're brave, and you're not alone." I showed it to my son. He smiled, eyes shining. "MOMC, real family finds you." And he was right. For the first time in decades, I allowed myself to dream, not about revenge, not about what could have been, but about what could be. A home filled with laughter. A son growing up safe, loved and confident. Friends and chosen family surrounding us. A life free of fear, guilt, and manipulation. I closed my journal that night, kissed my son goodnight, and whispered into the quiet room, "We did it. We really did it." The road had been long, painful, exhausting, but as I looked at the steady rise and fall of my son's chest in sleep, I knew the truth. Breaking the cycle wasn't about punishing the past. It was about reclaiming the present and building a future that no one could control, and that was freedom. The first weeks after the court ruling were surreal. No more threats, no more whispered rumors, no more feeling the weight of their judgment pressing on every move I made. For the first time in years, I felt the quiet joy of ordinary life. I woke up each morning to the sound of my son humming while brushing his teeth. Breakfasts were loud, messy, full of spilled cereal and laughter. No one yelled if a cup tipped over, no one demanded perfection, no one stood with arms crossed waiting for mistakes. It was ordinary life, but it felt like freedom. Some days, the memories hit hard. A glance at my son doing something as simple as washing his hands too slowly might bring back my father's voice or my mother's sharp tone. I'd take a deep breath, remind myself where we were now, and guide him gently, never harshly. It was a practice in mindfulness, patience, and love. I realized the small, everyday choices mattered more than dramatic confrontations. This was how the cycle truly ended, not in courtrooms, not in heated words, but in the way I raised him every day. One afternoon, while my son played in the backyard, I received a call from my mother. I froze. Part of me wanted to ignore it. Part of me wondered what ploy she might have this time. "Hello," I said cautiously. Her voice was quiet, tentative. I just wanted to say I'm sorry. I know that doesn't fix anything, but I'm trying to understand. And I wanted you to know that." I closed my eyes, letting the words wash over me. It wasn't a dramatic apology, not the kind that demands forgiveness. Just an acknowledgement. "That was enough. Thank you," I said softly. "That means more than you know." Days turned into weeks and life settled into a rhythm. We went to the park on weekends. We baked cookies together. I watched my son sleep peacefully, free from the fear I had endured as a child. And in those moments, I felt a sense of triumph, not over my parents, but over the past itself. I began to share more of my story publicly, writing blog posts about the struggles of navigating toxic family dynamics and the importance of protecting children from cycles of abuse. The response was overwhelming. Messages poured in from people who had suffered in silence, who had been too afraid to speak up, and who found hope in our story. One morning, a letter arrived, not from my parents, not from the courts but from a reader who had been inspired by my words. Thank you for sharing your story. You gave me the courage to protect my children and set boundaries I never thought I could enforce. You are stronger than you know. I showed it to my son. He grinned, eyes wide. MOMC. We're helping people. Yes, baby, I whispered, hugging him. We are. Months passed. My parents occasionally sent small messages, sometimes a photo, sometimes a note of apology. I read them, considered them, but did not respond immediately. My boundaries were firm. I was kind when I chose to be, but I would not allow manipulation to creep back in. I realized that reconciliation, if it ever came, had to be on my terms and only if it truly respected our safety and dignity. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting our living room in shades of gold, my son curled up beside me on the couch. "Mom," he said, "do you think they'll ever change?" I smiled, stroking his hair. "I don't know. And it doesn't matter. What matters is that we've changed. We're building something better, right here. And that's what counts." He nodded, satisfied, and leaned against me. The transformation wasn't dramatic. It wasn't cinematic. But it was real. Every meal cooked together without tension. Every bedtime story, every hug untainted by fear, these were victories. And with each small victory, I felt stronger, more certain of who I was. I was no longer the frightened child, holding about in trembling hands. I was no longer the adult living under the shadow of guilt and expectation. I was a mother, a protector, a storyteller, a survivor. The final piece of closure came unexpectedly. One afternoon, my cousin visited. We sat on the porch, sipping tea, watching the wind stir the leaves. "You've done something incredible," she said. "Not just surviving, but breaking the cycle. You've created a safe space for the next generation." "That's rare," I smiled, feeling the weight of years lift. "It's not just me. My son helped me, and I had support from people who believed in us." She nodded. "And that's real family. You found it, even when the people who share your blood couldn't give it." That night, as I tucked my son into bed, I whispered the promise I'd made years ago. "No one will ever make you feel small again. Not me, not anyone. You are safe. You are loved. You are free." And for the first time, I knew it was true. We had survived. We had fought. And we had won not through vengeance, but through courage, truth, and love. Life had begun to settle into a rhythm that felt like freedom, but real freedom, the kind that only comes after storms have passed. Mornings were filled with the warm smell of toast and fresh coffee. My son laughed more freely than I had ever seen, his small hands shaping our world with crayons and building blocks. Evenings were calm. We watched movies, read stories, and sometimes, in the quiet hours, I would trace the lines of his face and marvel at how resilient he was, how much he had grown despite everything. One afternoon, I received a call from a support group coordinator. "Your story inspired so many," she said. "People are reaching out daily, sharing their experiences, thanking you for giving them courage." I felt a warmth that had nothing to do with pride and everything to do with hope. Our story, the struggle, the pain, the fight, was no longer a burden hidden in shadow. It was a beacon. I shared the call with my son. His eyes sparkled. "Mom, we're making a difference." "Yes, baby," I whispered. "We are." The days rolled into weeks, and with each passing moment, the fear that had once gripped my life loosened its hold. I even began to feel something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. joy without hesitation. I smiled at my reflection in the mirror, noticing how strong I had become. How the scars, both visible and invisible, had not defined me. How, instead, they had forged a resilience I could never have imagined. Then came an unexpected gesture from my parents, a letter, handwritten. This time. It was brief. We understand we hurt you. We hope you can forgive us someday. We will respect your boundaries and your choices. No demands. No guilt. No manipulation. I read it with a calm heart. I folded it neatly and placed it in a drawer. I wasn't rushing to forgive, not yet. Forgiveness is a journey, not a declaration. But the acknowledgement was enough for me to close the door on old fears. One bright Saturday morning, we decided to celebrate. We invited a few close friends over. Laughter echoed through the house as children played, adults chatted, and the scent of home-cooked meals filled the air. My son ran past me, giggling uncontrollably, and I realized something profound. Safety, love, and happiness didn't have to come with strings attached. They could be ordinary, simple, everyday miracles. As the day wound down, I found a quiet moment on the porch, my son at my side. I like it here, Mom, he said softly. I feel safe. I brushed back his hair, my chest tightening with emotion. That's because you are safe, baby. And nothing, no one will ever take that away from you again. He smiled, curling against me. And in that embrace, I felt the culmination of every choice I had made. Every stand, every boundary, every act of courage. We had built a life not defined by fear, but by love, respect, and empowerment. In the quiet of that evening, I took out my journal. I wrote, "The past does not define us. Pain is a teacher, not a jailer. We can choose how we live, how we love, and how we protect those we care about. And that choice is ours, always." I closed it and looked at my son. He was asleep, peaceful and radiant. I felt a profound sense of gratitude for the journey we had taken together, its trials, its storms, its victories. For the first time, I could say without hesitation, we were free, and we would stay that way. Life had settled, but even in calm waters, ripples of the past occasionally reached us. One afternoon, as I was sorting through old boxes in the attic, I stumbled upon a set of letters I had never opened. They were addressed to me from my mother, dated years ago, before the anger, before the yelling, before the trauma became daily life. Curiosity outweighed fear, and I unfolded the first letter. It was raw, unfiltered, and almost unbearably human. "I don't know how to be a mother. I want to love you, but I feel lost, angry, and afraid. I hope one day you'll understand that my flaws are my own, and not your fault." Tears pricked my eyes. In that moment, I realized something profound. My mother had never learned to navigate love without fear. And while that didn't excuse her actions, it added a layer of understanding I had never allowed myself to feel. I sat with the letters for hours, reading them one by one. Some were apologies she never delivered. Some were confessions of fear and inadequacy. And hidden within them, I found glimpses of the little girl she once was, afraid, hurting, and trapped by generational cycles she didn't know how to break. I didn't call her. I didn't respond. But I folded the letters carefully and placed them in a box I would keep for reflection, not reconciliation. That evening, my son asked if he could help me make dinner. He carried vegetables, cracked eggs, and stirred sauce like a little chef. As we cooked together, I realized the most important thing wasn't forgiving the past or explaining the past. It was building the present. It was laughter in the kitchen, It was small hands helping me chop peppers and tear lettuce. It was choosing every day to create safety and love. A few weeks later, an unexpected visitor arrived, my father's old friend, the one who had tried to persuade me to respect elders. Years ago, "I've been watching you," he said quietly, as my son played nearby. "You've done something remarkable. You've broken a cycle that's haunted this family for generations. You've raised a boy who will never fear love, and that is a legacy stronger than anything else." I felt a rush of gratitude, not just for him, but for the truth finally being seen, not just by strangers, but by people connected to the family who had once tried to manipulate me. That night, I wrote one final entry in my journal. The past is a teacher, not a jailer. The choices we make today shape the lives of those we love. Courage isn't about fighting others, it's about standing for what is right, protecting the innocent, and creating space for healing. We can choose freedom. And we did. Weeks turned into months. We celebrated birthdays, holidays, and ordinary days alike. The house filled with the music of laughter, storytelling, and comfort. My son grew confident, kind, and resilient. I grew into my own strength, unapologetic and empowered, and in the rare moments when my parents attempted to reach out, I responded with clarity and boundaries, a polite acknowledgement, and then space. They could exist in our lives only if they respected the rules. One morning, while drinking tea on the porch, my son looked up at me and said, "Mom, do you think we're really free?" I smiled, feeling the sun warm our faces. "Yes, baby," I said softly. "Free to live, free to love, and free to choose our family. Always." He grinned, running off to chase the neighbor's cat, laughter ringing through the yard, and as I watched him, I realized the story wasn't just about survival or revenge. It was about reclaiming life, rewriting history, and creating a future that belonged to us, not to fear, not to anger, not to control. The house was quiet, but not empty. It was filled with life, laughter, and safety, the quiet triumph of survival and love over fear and control. My son played in the living room, his laughter spilling into the hallways. I watched him, a profound sense of peace filling me, the weight of years of trauma lifting. I sat down at my desk, the old journal open before me. For so long, I had written in secret, capturing every moment of fear, anger, and pain. But now, I wrote differently. We are alive. We are free. We have chosen love over fear, courage over silence, and truth over manipulation. The past does not define us. Our story is ours to tell, and we have chosen how it ends. Looking back, I realized that revenge wasn't about punishing my parents. It wasn't about making them feel fear or guilt. Revenge, true, lasting revenge, was about reclaiming my power, my life, and my son's innocence. It was about breaking cycles, refusing to pass down pain, and living fully on our own terms. Some nights I thought of them, the parents who had hurt me, who had tried to control my life. I felt neither hatred nor fear. I felt compassion filtered through distance. I understood their limitations, their own unhealed pain. But I no longer carried it. We had won in the only way that truly mattered, by choosing life over oppression, love over fear, and courage over submission. I held my son close, whispering into the quiet room, "You are safe. You are loved. You are free. And I will always protect that for you." He smiled sleepily, and I knew in that moment that every fight, every tear, every sleepless night had been worth it. We had survived. We had thrived. And the story we were writing now together was filled with laughter, love, and hope. The past had shaped us, but it no longer defined us. We were the authors of our own future, and this time, we would write it in light.